by Policy Circle. My name is Sajna, and I will do the introductions for today. International Women's Day is celebrated on March 8th every year, and the theme this year is Gender Equality for a Sustainable Tomorrow. India is still struggling to bridge inequality across sectors and celebrate the contribution of women in various fields. The topic today is From Tokenism to Mainstreaming, Strategies to Achieve Gender Equality in Public Decision Making. We have a panel of eminent speakers today. Mary E. John is among India's most prominent scholars in women's studies and feminist politics. She was director of Center for Women's Development Studies, New Delhi. She earned her PhD in Women's Studies from the University of California at Santa Cruz. Our next speaker is Anjali Bansal. She's the founder of Avaana Capital, an investment firm that supports entrepreneurs and startups in technology space. She was earlier non-executive chairperson of Dena Bank. She has been an active investor in companies including Delivery, Nykaa, Safari, Alpha Vector, and Lenskart. Dakshita Das is a former civil servant with extensive experience in the financial sector. She has worked as MD and CEO of National Housing Bank and was a member, board of directors at Bank of India. Our moderator today is Srinath Sridharan, a board member, transformation coach, and mentor. He is a strategic counsel with leading corporates across sectors such as automobile, e-commerce, advertising, and financial services for more than 2 decades. He is a prolific commentator who writes regularly for several media platforms, including Policy Circle. Thank you, Srinath, for agreeing to moderate the discussion. And I welcome you all to this edition of this Policy Circle webinar. Over to you, Srinath.
Thank you, Sajna. Hi, good morning, everybody. Good to be here. And for a change, it's good to be the minority in this women's panel. And to start off, how I wish we could actually get to a stage where we don't need to discuss gender equality at all. In society, we're only treating everybody with equal opportunities and rights. And I want to question this: who is one gender to impose their beliefs on the others, or even their tenets and dictats? Today, we have a wonderful set of panelists, leaders from different spheres of life. I mean, Mary represents academics and research, Anjali from the business circle, Dakshita from public policy. And rightfully, this intersection of research, business, and public policy could potentially create a positive world for all of us. And with this, I have a question to ask, which is, why do we celebrate these special days when we still have 364 days in the year? And what do we actually do with that? And that's a question that I keep pondering every year when we celebrate these special days. And especially in a country where we still have the isms, we still have the divide, rural, urban, we still have the divide of socio-economic barriers. How are we going to actually bridge this inequality across spheres? The format of the discussions, what I propose is this: we will start off with each panelist who will share their views and insights for about 10-12 minutes, after which we'll go around for another round of interjections, refutals, rebuttals for the next 8 to 10 minutes each, and post which we'll take questions from the audience. So I just want to, before I hand over the mic to Mary, I just want to request the panelists to cover their views on what would it take from this tokenism, the tick mark approach that we do with affirmative action, to how do we make it the actual backbone of the society? I mean, that will be my endeavor if we can steer the conversation around it. Thank you. Mary, would you want to take the lead, please?
First of all, thank you to Policy Circle for inviting me. I think this is my first opportunity to be part of your group and your platform. Yeah, as introduced, I am a researcher, so whenever I speak, it's I draw from that body of research. And what I wanted to say here, and maybe just by way of throwing things in, because I work in these areas, is that gender equality actually turns out to be one of the most challenging, one of the most paradoxically challenging areas of inequality, I think, compared to any other at this point in India today. And so I just thought to get us going, I just put out a few so-called facts. I work with numbers, I work with data. So firstly, when we think about gender in India, and especially I think post the so-called gang rape of December 2012, which brought, I think, issues of inequality and violence into public view as never before. I think violence has occupied a very special place. I mean, there was a time when, in fact, Delhi was called the rape capital of the world, and all kinds of epithets were thrown out. I want to begin with violence because it's the one that people can relate to most obviously. It's news, it's in the news, it's something we know, we experience it, because it's a subject of the kind of paradox or the kind of confusion that I think also attends some of our most well-meaning efforts to understand the nature of the problem before us. So the first point I want to make when it comes to some of the ugliest forms of violence against women, the one that we may often think about as the one of the factors that keeps women away from this public world that we want women to be part of, and the fact that we want to see women take on, as you say in the title, more decision making. What's going on here? A very common response is that it's a violent world out there, and therefore women would rather stay away, remain in the protection of home and so on, rather than step out. And here the first conundrum or the first worry I want to put before you, and I'm drawing here on National Crimes Record Bureau data, that is the data that is put out by our police stations and collected by the Ministry of Home Affairs. And that is that out of 100, if you take 100% as cases of rape in our country, I mean, I could, when I'm in a room, I often ask people to just give me a guess as to there's a very basic distinction that is made between when the perpetrator is known to the victim or a stranger. So you have stranger rape, the so-called Nirbhaya case was a classic case of stranger rape. And I ask people, what do you think? Do you think there's more cases of stranger rape and more cases of acquaintance rape? And people actually don't know. To be frank, people don't know. People assume that actually there should be, the biggest danger is out there. It's after dark. It's the empty streets and so on. And they are really shocked that in the actual year of the Nirbhaya case, the NCRB data gave us a figure of 98% of cases are known to the victim. 2% are stranger rape. So I begin with this just to get us to realize the extent to which we are probably misinformed or confused when we think about things like violence. Violence, actually everyday violence and other forms of violence are in fact much more common from people we know and trust than from the stranger. And it is one of the aspects of socialization where I think we get things very wrong. We tell our daughters, we tell our sons also how they should behave outside, how they should behave. We tell our daughters not to speak to strangers. We tell them to come home when it's dark. We never tell anyone, please watch out. Watch out from those who you place your trust in. Watch out from those who have power over you. It is workplaces, it is larger families, it is where I have been in the universities. These are spaces where a great deal of violence actually takes place. And the fear of speaking out against those you know is one of the biggest inhibitors to actually enabling women to take their place. So that's the first point I want to make. The second is probably a slightly happier one, which is to say we don't really even seem to recognize where we have made progress. And one of the areas where we have made the most obvious progress is education. From a time, and I'm looking now at higher education, from a time, say at the time of 1950, soon after we became independent, there were about 1 lakh students who were part of colleges and so on, out of whom 10% were women. This figure jumped already by 2000 to 40%. And today it is actually nudging close to parity. We have 48%. If you look at the All India Survey of Higher Education, we have almost 48% of our entire, this includes all manners of undergraduate education. So it's a hugely diverse, heterogeneous group that I'm referring to, from the most, your engineering, IITs, IIMs, all the way to your B.Ed, teaching shops. So it is a very diverse group, but within that, there is a very large number. And it's one of the places, I live in Delhi University, it's one of the places actually where we see very large numbers of women. If we think about it, where do we see women in public life in good number? One of them is our higher education institutions. And even the hallowed sort of engineering colleges and so on managements are seeing change happening. The question though, and that's where we once again get into paradox and problems, is what happens after? What happens after these women gain? So clearly there's a push, clearly there's an aspiration. Families, the women themselves are stepping, it's a no-no to be at home. The days are long gone when we, worried about girls going to school. Those days are gone. In fact, there are certain areas, certain districts where boys are dropping out more than girls. So we have a very complex problem here, but we can say girls and women are doing much, much better here. The question is what happens after? And that's where things get rather dire. And and I'm very glad to have on my panel here, people from the bureaucracy and people from business, because the most worrying aspect of our contemporary, and I'm talking contemporary times, are our employment rates. We are seeing since the 1990s, at least, stagnant or declining employment rates. And this is supported by data, whether it's census data, whether it is the National Sample Survey Organization, and so on. We are seeing declines. First of all, I think when I ask people, do you have an idea about where women are working more for some kind of return in terms of pay? Do you think it's urban India? Do you think it's rural India? Everybody thinks it's urban India, and that's wrong. There are many more women working for some kind of pay of whatever kind in rural India. It's about 30+% in rural India, and it's about 15% to 20% in urban India. So this idea that our cities are the places of opportunity for women is actually not quite right. Most women, unfortunately, work out of necessity, not out of desire, not for careers. And those numbers, as I said, have been declining in the high growth years, which is the most scary part, because the 1990s, as we know, we went into double digits when it came to growth, but yet it was either stagnation or decline. And continuously now, as we can imagine, and pandemic would have added its own dimension to the whole issue. In urban India, the largest groups of women who work are school teachers and paid domestic workers. We are a very, very small minority. We barely sort of make any kind of impact in terms of numbers. And we need to ask ourselves, therefore, what combination, because I hear a great deal about the fact that women still occupy a very large part of domestic responsibilities, care of children, elderly, managing the home, and these are enormous, these are huge areas of work. And I get upset when women tell me I don't work, meaning that they don't have a paid job. I get really upset, because in fact, the work of the home is enormous. If women were paid, Amartya Sen made this joke that if in fact all women divorced their husbands and were re-employed as housekeepers, we would see a trebling of our GDP. And it needed someone like Amartya Sen to say so. So that's not my point at all. My point is we are seeing a situation where the combination of this idea that women's primary responsibilities must be the home, and these have increased even with having fewer children. Those responsibilities have not gone down. If anything, they have increased, is going hand in hand with, and this I think is not being said enough, the kind of economic policies that we have, the kind of job opportunities, decent work, as the ILO would put it, decent work. What kind of decent work is out there? What kind of safety measures are out there that would enable women to actually, because if you ask women, if you look at our, the unemployed, educated unemployed, the figures are very high. They're very high. And in my research, when I go out into the field and ask women, they all want to they want to work. They would like to be able to work. It is not the old story of, oh, I would like to only stay at home. So we need to understand this. And when we have more and more educated women with and many of whom have professional degrees, are thinking of them primarily as exchangeable, and I'm sorry to put it rather crudely here, exchangeable in the marriage market rather than in the job market, then I think we have a crisis on our hands. And I think there is this crisis where many women are working because they have to, because husbands are not keeping, that's amongst the poor. Husbands do not work to hold the family together. And we are seeing those of us who could be working, not finding or not handing or deciding, actively deciding not to be part of this workforce. In other words, perpetuating a certain form of dependency on men for our economic survival. So we are seeing this paradoxical combination of forms of violence, forms of educational aspiration and advancement, and a very bleak employment scenario that somehow is not gaining the kind of public traction that it ought to have. So I thought I'll stop here, put these out for us to think through, discuss, disagree, comment on. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mary. Anjali, coming on to you with this point, and this is a topic that we have spoken much before. And how do we actually mainstream a lot more women in productive employment? And to Mary's point about paid employment, and what is it that you're seeing currently with lots of startups? The ecosystem is changing, youngsters are coming forward. But are you seeing more number of younger girls getting onto the corporate India or venture work?
So, Srinath, thank you for having me on this panel. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you to Policy Circle also. So much of what Mary said completely resonates. And let me pick up from where she left and also start with some data. But let me start with actually my own data in some ways. My entering engineering class, we were 15 women out of 350. So you do the math, sub 5%. Today, that number is closer to 30%. Srinath, when you and I started thinking about, how many women on boards, 15 years ago, we were 3.5% women on Indian boards. Today, there's change in corporate India and global corporate, but also legislative support and regulatory support. We now have close to 20% women on boards. So I want to start with these two statistics to show that the needle has moved. In some ways, the slope of the curve is in the right direction. We are making progress. Question is, are we making enough progress? 50% of the world is female, more or less, right? So whether it's 49, 51, gender ratios being what they are. Ruth Bader Ginsburg very famously said, women should be everywhere decisions are being made. Because in the absence of involving 50% of our species, we are actually sort of under-leveraging the total talent potential of the human race. I would sort of put it out there. It's not about business, it's not about government, but really as a society and as a species, if we are not tapping into half our talent pool for the most part, or we are biasing ourselves in such a way that it is not fully effective, it is actually bad for all of us, whether it is in business or otherwise. Now let's go to the points that Mary made, and I completely agree, Mary. And it is such a paradox where we are now seeing much better, greater intake. So if you think about the total pipe, to some extent between government and society and social attitudes and policy, we have sort of addressed the intake problem. Girls going to school is a given. We still have, of course, extremely underprivileged segments, whether they are geographic segments or they are social segments where girls do not have access to education. That's still work in progress. But a lot of work has been done and we are seeing the outcomes, positive outcomes. I spoke about 20% women on board. So what happens in the middle? And it seems like we are seeing two divergent trends. One is our segments of society where for economic reasons, it is not a choice. Her income is critical to the family. So she's not working out of choice. She would prefer to not have to do two jobs, right? One at home and one at work. She has to work because her income is critical. But in those segments, which are highly educated, affluent, and with probably the largest, highest earning potential and highest degree of influence in the workplace, who should be getting into leadership roles, we are seeing a significant drop-off. We have seen a decline in female labor force participation, Mary also referred to, and it's actually quite alarming. It's happening in rural India, it's happening in urban India as well. We see anecdotally in our circles, in our organizations. The other hat, I wear a couple of other hats. I sit on some large public company boards. including Tata and Piramal, and some very, very fine organizations. I'm also president of Bombay Chamber. And it's a discussion we have constantly in the chamber. How do we get this trend that we are seeing of declining women in our teams and in our organizations? What can we do to fix that? Srinath, you mentioned startup world. We're actually seeing a positive trend. More women are going into entrepreneurship, at least of this segment, the educated, high achieving segment. They're going into entrepreneurship. Sometimes they're dropping out of the quote unquote of the corporate workplace. They're saying, I don't want to deal with that. I'm going to work on my own terms. I'll start. And capital is now more available. There is still very strong bias. There are various studies that show that globally, just about 3.5% to 5%, depending on which study you look at, of total venture capital goes to women-founded businesses. So yes, there's a lot of work to be done, but we are seeing positive trajectory here. I think the question in my mind that has to be addressed. One is, what is the state and society doing? Are we doing enough as government and policy, as well as society, to support our girls to participate more in workplace, not in education? Second is, are we doing enough as families in how we raise not our girls, but our boys? Because how will we ever get to equitable workplaces if you don't have equitable home places? So if the burden and responsibility of domestic work, which as we all know is largely unpaid and hence largely unrecognized, if that is really, I think, and some of those attitudes are getting stronger actually. And it's the affluence paradox. As society is becoming more affluent, the income is not required. So she is then expected to really be the world's best mother, wife, daughter-in-law, daughter, all of that. And now what is the definition of that, right? The best. So I think some of that work still needs to be done. State policies, for the most part, state does their bit. I acknowledge, Mary, what you said around sort of violence and how can, particularly in the manufacturing and agricultural sector, where so many more women are working, whether they're employed or casual workers, there's work to be done on safety and social attitudes that promote safety. But at the same time, I think even in urban and semi-urban areas, it really does come down to social attitudes, and those originate out of the family. Because ultimately, whether it is organizations, government or business or education, or individuals, they all exist in the context of society. So it is our social attitudes and familial attitudes. Familial attitudes are now not just permitting, but encouraging their girls and women to be educated, but not encouraging their married women to expect sharing of domestic responsibility. I think there's such a switch you see when you see young women coming into the workforce. They are bright, they are educated, they are ambitious, they want to do it all. Then they get married, then they have children, and something switches. So I'm going to pause there. Work to be done in educating our boys, not just our girls.
Thanks, Anjali. That's interesting. And so with that, Mary's context and your context, let's move on to Dakshita to hear about what's the policy world thinking about it. And more importantly, I think the policy challenge is that almost, so I'm here hypothesizing, that we always talk about the lowest common denominator in policy circles. And how do we actually turn the needle and say, can we go across the spectrum? Over to you. We can't hear you, ma'am. You're on mute.
So thank you, Srinath, and thank you, Policy Circle, for having me here. First of all, it's extremely difficult to match up to what Mary and Anjali have said because they bring in ripe data, rich data. But one point which Anjali said, which I will like to pick up from, and which Simone de Beauvoir had said several decades ago. Actually, one is not born a woman, one becomes a woman. And that is where the crux lies, that India has to change culturally and sociologically in terms of mindsets. But let's start from the very beginning, as they say. Let's start with independent India. It was extremely interesting that the Constitution gave equal rights to women. We didn't have a suffragette movement like the West had, or rather with that intensity, we got equal voting rights. There was rapid reform which happened on the Hindu Marriage Act at that stage. So the enabling environment was created right in the early decades for having equity-based domestic growth. But if we look at it, what went wrong? Or rather, why didn't we capitalize? There's no wrong about it. I stand corrected. But why was India not able to capitalize in terms of leapfrogging the women into a space of their own? So from my study of government policies and their impact, one was that government policy focused largely on maternity and healthcare for women. The Vishaka judgment, of course, was a game changer in the 80s when it brought in a certain sense of safety for women at their workplace and the right to make or take their, have their say. But we can say that until India started turning and becoming a part of the global village of bound by technology, frankly speaking, the restriction, the self-awareness of women was, I will get married, I will have a child, and I will be a good sister, daughter, mother, etc. And that is where the crux lies. The idea is to create self-awareness. And here I would like to bring to the notice of the audience that the biggest self-awareness has come out in the voting rights. And that's where you see from 2014 onwards that the self-awareness of women is translating itself into electoral results. And that's where campaigns have now started moving, and very actively so. The technology revolution, the self-awareness revolution, the soap opera revolution, the television revolution, whatever you want to put it. But it's all based around a particular ecosystem where that sense of empowerment is coming in. Yes, I agree with Mary that job opportunities are limited. And yes, I agree with Anjali that you join in the beginning and then you drop out very fast. But that could be a mental laze also, or it could be the sheer domestic pressure. I personally believe that for me, working was very easy. It was never a choice not to work. But office was tough because we are still working with male dominated scenarios. The old traditional, it will take another 10 years also. And then let's not forget, India has got a very vast population. But if you look at it, there is a revolution which is happening in terms of self awareness. Does that self awareness translate itself into long term employment gains? Does it translate itself into economic empowerment? It definitely does. One of the most primary moves the government made was in the JAM Trinity. And we find that women got a lot of the Jandan accounts. And we find that it gives them economic empowerment. We also look at Mudra, which focuses on women. And I don't have the statistics with me, but colloquially, I can definitely conclude that the lowest NPAs will be coming from there. And maybe Anjali will be in a better space because she's in that sector. We also have a very active campus recruitment policy where at the higher end, women recruitment is encouraged. And girls are given a certain amount of preference over boys in the initial stages. What is missing? And that neither the government can address nor anybody can address except for the families, which is to stand on your own 2 feet and have an awareness. Yes, I can. And yes, I'm going to be totally gender neutral. When we speak of women representation on boards, which is abetted by government and legislation, and SEBI comes down very heavily on boards when you don't have adequate women representation. Let's not forget, it's actually a gender neutral space. Board notes are gender neutral. Does having a woman over there, does it fulfill a goal of giving a space to them, or does it fulfill a goal of the entity benefiting? I would rather that we move towards an awareness where the latter is more important than the former. And that's where the game will change. All three of your panelists, Srinath, are women who have made their own mark in their own ways. And that's without, I think, at a time when I presume benefits were not there in the educational space, either in terms of scholarships. And here I would like to draw attention to the fact that the lower income groups are really benefiting from some of the scholarship schemes which the government has recently launched, in which there is tax relief also. Or we didn't have such a campus recruitment benefit. I drifted from college to college with the only option available of taking the civil services or becoming a lawyer. But today, when I speak with my young son, he competes with an added problem that the space in a pie of 100, the space available to boys is less. So what is a problem, I think, is more a question of self-awareness. But I'm getting repetitive now, so I will hand the mic back to you, Srinath, and let's take it on from there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So with these points, I want to come back to Mary, and probably the phrase that comes to my mind is, do we have poverty of privileges, which is against gender, poverty of privileges? And if there are any poverty of privileges, I mean, what are those key ones which hinder our growth? Because I think apart from just this panel conversing, it is not as if the democratic process of parliament does not know. It is not as if our regulators don't know. It is not as if as the wise councils of various corporates don't know this problem. And yet we have not seen much of action. And here I might probably be the more impatient one amongst all of you of saying that to Anjali's data point that we have moved the needle, but the needle is so slow that we may not live to see the needle actually of our life decisions, anything beyond that. So if there were a couple of wish list, Mary, that you would have of what could be those concrete policy impetus that we could take, what would those be?
Thank you, and thanks to the participants for adding more to our discussion here. If I want to be a little provocative, we have a tendency, especially in India, and these phrases did come up in our discussions, to think of the problem of gender inequality as primarily social, cultural, and I think the word was used, mindsets. The term mindset is a very interesting one. It sort of indicates that our minds have been set in a way that's out of sync with, usually when we say mindset, we mean traditional mindset. We mean, and therefore the burden of the problem remains in our thinking, the home, the family, and so on. And as it was put very well, that amongst the most poor, they have to work. They would rather not. They would withdraw if they could, but they can't because they have, alcoholic husbands, whatever, casual labor that doesn't keep the family together. So they work. And then we have the better off who are choosing not to. The reluctant worker effect, they're choosing not to. Now, my worry with this and my disagreement with this scenario is that it's like one hand clapping. We have, and I want to say this, let us contrast ourselves, say, with China. And let's not go to the West, let's go to China. China, what kind of an economic policy did China have? What kind of modernization China had when it had some of the worst forms of patriarchy? We can go to the foot binding and whatnot, the worst. They actually worked on a policy that was at once cultural, so no foot binding. They even said they said no to any kind of jewelry. They thought that as part of, the subordination of women. So if you look at a certain generation of Chinese women, you'll notice they wear nothing of that nature. So yes, profound cultural change needed, profound changes in the home needed, and so on. Divorce laws or other kinds of marriage laws needed to be changed, but they centered it on work. It was work-centered, and it meant that everybody worked. It meant that men and women and whatever had to be part of a workforce. It was rural, urban, and so on. And that has continued with all the changes over the 20th century into the 21st century. That remains, in fact, largely in place. We didn't have that kind of, in our 20th century, long 20th century, we have had remarkable social reform. but it stayed largely at the level of changes in family law and education. And in the post-independence period, especially in the since the 80s, 90s onwards, we've had a pattern of what is either being called jobless growth or job loss growth, which is the most scary part. Because if you have such a situation where no new jobs are effectively being created, or rather more jobs are being lost than are being than new jobs are being put in place, we have a situation where choice then has to be made. That is to say, if you want to choose the woman and you want to give her a chance, you have to do so in your own thinking. And this is where I think there could be a mindset on the part of employers and others. It has to be at the expense of someone else. And so we have a very difficult problem here of not so much gender equality as gender conflict. Because if you think of giving work to women at the expense of men, then unfortunately public patriarchy is such that men will be preferred. We have, even especially in North India, where things are worse than in the South, we have these garment factories where, you hear about Bangladesh and so on, where you have these large numbers of women workers in these garment factories. Now, if you were to go to Haryana, around Delhi, you will see that 70 to 80% of the workers are actually men. In a situation where work opportunities are so low, you are seeing men taking on work. And let us look at all our sectors. Let us look at our entertainment sector, look at the airline sector, look at our flight attendants, renamed flight attendants, and see the large proportion of men who are doing what would be considered feminine work. Therefore, I do see a public policy problem here. I see a political economy problem here, which is going in tandem with familial and other kinds of. So the fact that sons are not being re-socialized, as I think was very well said, that yes, of course, but will the re-socialized sons say, okay, I won't work, let my wife work? Is that what we're looking at? And are those the kinds of choices we're asking of people? So I really would say that we must put both these sides of the story together and ask ourselves, why are we reproducing quote unquote traditional ideas in a 21st century context where actually women would like it to be different? That requires the public story being put in place as well.
Thank you, Mary. To pick on the same point about women participation in workforce and probably pushing it to the corporate house, this is a question I want to ask Anjali. And we have large business groups in India which have presence in sectors where there are enough women talent available even at the leadership level. And yet, if you look at some of those, let's say BFSI, the amount of women CXOs are still in single digit in some of those large groups, which profess the conversation about ESG, governance, empowering women. So there is a subtle glass ceiling somewhere out there. How do we chip that? Or how do we just simply crack it? It's not that they're not talented. It's not as if their headcount is not available. It's not as if, let's say, their experience or exposure won't allow them to run these businesses. And yet we are just slowly, very, very slow in turning that needle.
Great question, Srinath. But I would say that from a place that I've been very fortunate.
Sorry, your voice is not clear, Anjali. I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Not able to hear you.
Okay, give me a second.
Okay.
I'm going to.
Go ahead. We can hear you now. Perfect.
So I've been very fortunate to work in organizations that have been relatively gender blind. So I worked briefly at ISRO, but that was very brief. And as a young person in a lab, you really don't feel any of these things. My first real job was at McKinsey in New York, doing financial services strategy for your Wall Street investment banks, investment firms, etc. Right? So most of my teams, my colleagues at McKinsey, most of my teams were men, my clients were men, and it actually did not seem to matter at all. Perhaps because it was early days of one's career, but also because the organization played a very important role in not making you feel your gender. I mean, I love the way Dakshita said, right, that you're not born in the workplace. Nobody is born a man or woman. Yes, biologically at home, you're born a man or woman, but in the workplace, you're not born a man or woman. You're made to feel that way. And so one was fortunate in that. Over the years, and Srinath, coming back to your point, why do we not see more? Actually, I think we have in India probably seen more women leaders in business than many other countries. We've had women's head of banks, we've had prime minister, finance minister, defense minister, president. So India, we have a unique paradox. And someone very eloquently said that whatever is true in India, the opposite is also equally true. So on the one hand, we have extremely empowered, powerful, influential women who are absolutely getting to the top of their professions, whatever the profession is. Whether you take the legal profession, right? You have Zia and Pallavi and so on, right? So every profession you do see women at top. The question is, are there enough? Not just at the top. I think it's a pipeline issue. Middle management, you will always find exceptional people in whatever sphere getting to the top. What is happening at the middle management level is where I see drop off and a lot more leakage in the pipeline. For the most part, good organizations today are acutely conscious of diversity and inclusion of different types, not just gender, but recognizing you get to better problem solving outcomes when you have diverse teams. So it is enlightened self-interest of organizations as it should be. It should not be a policy-led, policy-driven action. But good organizations are realizing they're going out of their way to attract, retain, grow, motivate their women in the workforce. We are often now having conversations about how to make manufacturing and agriculture a safer place, more comfortable place for women to work. And the third shift law, for example. Now, the third shift can only be put into place in manufacturing if, I suppose, policymakers feel comfortable that industry will take adequate steps to ensure safety of women in that third shift. But back to leadership, why are there not more? I think it is less about women at the top and more about in the pipeline. There's something happening that is causing women to drop out. And it goes back to, do you want it enough? And if you think about all the actors in this play, you have the state with its policy, you have organizations, hopefully enlightened organizations doing their bit, but at least in the hardware part. So the structures and the systems and the policies and flexi work and all of that, right? And work from home should actually make it easier. Pandemic has made it worse and that takes me to the software part. All of this is hardware. Hardware is easier to fix. The software part is the attitudes and the mindsets, whether it is the mid-level peers who are competing for a share of the pie, or it is the family setup where nobody can do 2 full-time jobs, men or women. And I would also say that why assume that there is some work that is for men and for women? I think work is also fairly gender agnostic. There was a very famous, infamous global university president who suggested that women might not be good at math. Right? So whether it's a math brain or an art brain, so we should not even go there. There is no work that is particularly better or worse for men or women unless it requires a degree of physical strength, which, as we know, men will have more of. I'm going to pause there.
Sure, thanks. So as a venture capitalist, are you seeing more, let's say, narrowing of this gender gap in the ideation, innovation to entrepreneurship space? And are you seeing this gap shrink with the younger audience that's coming in?
The gap is narrowing, but not fast enough. So 2 things we see specifically. It is still harder for women-led startups to raise money. There are very few women GPs, and capital carries power with it. So when you have capital allocators who are fewer in number, that kind of trickles down. So women still find it harder to raise money, unfortunately. Second thing that we are seeing is that a lot of women-led startups, I shouldn't say a lot actually, there are more solo founder women-led startups than solo founder men-led startups. And that comes from natural networks. So the natural network for a girl growing up is her school and her college, as it is for boys. All the boys, 100% of that network goes into the workforce, right? So their natural network is much larger. Most of them co-founders are hostel mates, dorm mates, college mates, right? So that's where their founding teams come from. For girls, that is a much smaller network to start with. There are fewer women who are going into profession, and then it is shrinking. More women drop out. So the boys and the men, the young men, have 100% network. The women probably have 10 to 15% network. So that network effect also doesn't come out when they start building teams. And again, this is not one size fits all. It's not 100% of the time. So this is anecdotal.
Fair enough. I mean, it's an interesting pipeline and network issue problems, right? I mean, but if you don't fix it, hardware can be there. We are not going to turn the needle at all. So, which brings me to Dakshita's point about electoral process, especially women's suffrage. And while we have seen that the women voters count increase and the decision making at the grassroots level, local governance is improved, are there any statistics which show that they're actually working towards more for women empowerment? And I'm anecdotally saying that if I probably randomly ask 5 friends, women friends, about what is the biggest hurdle, my sense is probably some of them will say women are the hurdle for women empowerment as well. And it's a very anecdotal statement I'm making. But at the grassroots level, using policy, are there any large shifts that we have seen in the last, let's say, 20 years? And the reason why I'm saying 20 years is it has taken probably 10 years of post-liberalization effect, and also with availability of media, satellite TV, internet, and access.
So most certainly we find a, I'm so sorry, there is a loud sound. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's one of the hazards of being close to a railway track. Yes, most certainly there is a very clear shift in terms of electoral trends and in terms of women voter turnout. This year itself, when the election commission announced the state assemblies, it's also came out with a little statement. So many new voters are coming in, of which so many are going to be women. Better roads, electoral reforms, easier to cast their vote, and we find very distinct trends, like you see the triple talaq and what a significant role it played in terms of a particular outreach to women. And yes, the trends are very clear. But if I digress from your question a little bit, because Mary has given a very thought-provoking idea, what makes a societal change? Because she says that you contrast with China and let's talk mindsets. It's all about money at the end of it. And when the economy grows and when the population comes down a little bit, a wee bit, then you find automatically mindsets change. Everybody pitches in. Somebody comes home early, whether man or woman, and says, okay, I will bung in the lunch or the dinner together. Somebody gets up in the morning and says, okay, you take you work the whole night. But that's when it happens when you become economically empowered and there are adequate in occupational opportunities. Let's face the reality right now. Whichever sectors we are looking at, the opportunities are very tightly contested. So Mary's point is extremely valid, that until the opportunities grow, like it happened in Bangladesh or it happened in China. In China, the entire MSME sector was engaging a large number of women. And that remained the strength of China. I mean, men and women, they were all there. They were all there to deliver because they were contributing to economic growth. So again, whether we talk of electoral politics, which is a one-off, that is a sense of self-awareness that I've got a right to vote. I go, it's like a mela, I go, I vote for my candidate. I don't tell my husband who I'm voting for, blah, blah, whatever. That's a kind of a self-awareness, because we don't know what goes in the mind of the person who's casting the vote. However, what really makes households change is the job availability reality. And that's where, again, Anjali's point is very worrisome, that there is a higher income dropout, I think is what she has said. And that's worrisome. It means that somewhere down the line, either we are getting lazy, women that is, or the job opportunities are just not engaging our attention, or we've made our wealth and we are very happy living with our wealth at the higher income group and not giving the adequate opportunities to the middle and the lower sector. But yes, the electoral politics is something to watch out for. And my guess is that the 2024 elections are going to be really on the back of the women vote.
Thank you. So, Anjali, to provoke another conversation about, we generally use the phrase old boys network. And of course, without using the word old, when will we see girls network panning out in corporate India?
We have girls network. It's just not large
But
enough.
but
And
is
it
it
is not
as
as
influential?
geeky. Yeah, so it is probably less influential. And I'm saying probably because, again, this is with zero data, it's just very anecdotal. There is a girls' network. There is a very strong desire on the part of all women leaders I know to promote the cause of women, whether it is women entrepreneurs in their teams, to create those flexible, welcoming, positive work environments that enable women to flourish and thrive. So I would say it's just not large enough. And because it is not large enough, and also I think it's slightly generational. If you go back 20 years ago, there were so few women that a woman didn't necessarily want to be the woman. Those places were hard fought and hard won against kind of all odds. Social attitudes, workplace attitudes. Dakshita mentioned this, that yes, even though if you come from a progressive family, at work, you're still dealing with people who are coming out of their social context. So no woman at work wants to be the woman at work. And we often talk about this, leave your gender at the door when you enter the boardroom, because responsibilities for a board director are the same. Your obligations and liabilities are the same. Whether you're a man, woman, no one's going to cut any slack because you're female or because you're male. If something goes wrong, everyone's on the hook in exactly the same way. If you're a CEO, no one is cutting you. Your shareholders, your board members, your employees are not giving you any slack, whether you're a man or a woman. You probably get a little bit more slack if you're a man, honestly. So there is a network. It is active, probably less forceful, and definitely it is an inclusive network. So what do I mean by that? Women seldom try to leave anybody out, men or women. Sometimes we'll see, because of attitudes, men's networks may be exclusionary. Now, I have never been part of a men's network, so I can't tell you firsthand. I have been part of women's networks and they are not exclusionary. I also don't want to suggest that there aren't great women founders. In our own portfolio, we have some absolutely unbelievably strong, intelligent, smart, aggressive women founders. The founders of Arogya, which is doing antimicrobial resistance precision diagnostics, 2 women founders, both PhDs. BrainSight, which is doing neural mapping, again 2 women founder team. Animal, that is the first ever global marketplace for cattle, again women founders. So there are some absolutely wonderful young women coming into the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And they are winning not because they're women, but just because they are great entrepreneurs, they have a wonderful idea, and they're executing well.
Right. So going on to Mary, I mean, to just continue this thread, are you seeing, as you see your students entering, let's say, the university, are you seeing conversations change in the last 20, 30 years? Are you seeing them more empowered to question, to challenge the status quo? And more importantly, after they spend the time at the university, are they going and doing what they wanted to do? Or is it all only humbug, those 4 to 6 years in the university, and they just still simply disappear into the society?
Thank you. No, I want to add to what Anjali was actually talking about, this issue of networks, and then also maybe in what might be happening in the phase of your training, your higher education area. It's actually an interesting and a complex question. I did a study. I mean, I want to combine maybe my sense of what happens in our universities and colleges with a study I did of municipal corporations. As you know, as people actually may not realize, we've talked a lot about the panchayats and their reservations policy. Now 50% of panchayats have women, but 50% of our municipal corporations, the MCD, for instance, I looked at the MCD and I looked at the Bangalore, the BBMP in Bangalore, have now 50%. They had 33 earlier. And I was very interested in this network question. What's the difference? Because of the stereotype of the proxy, right? The proxy woman who's only holding the seat for the man who's going to come later. The issue, I think, and I would really like a conversation on this issue of networks. I think where the familial and where the domestic really kicks in is that when men have their networks which are as much kin based as they are, old boy networks. That's, we know this. We have this in politics. We have this in business as well. But it is one that can disregard women. Okay, so you'll be thinking about your uncle, your son, your brother, as well as your classmate, and what have you. When it comes to women, the problem is that the force of familial and other kinds are so strong that women will invariably be, and this is what makes women corruptible. Let me put it very provocatively. Makes them more quote unquote corruptible in the terms of the pressure on women, especially in politics, to to respond to familial pressures, given their dependency, given the fact that this familial kin network is unequal in terms of the gender nature of it. So we are looking at a situation where men are going to play a profound role, whether you like it or not, in most of these larger networks when it comes to women's place within it. And the same is not symmetrical when it comes to men's networks. They will be largely composed of men, with the occasional woman maybe thrown in. And in the college and university context, it's an incredible level of struggle. I will say this, as young women, and let's be clear also, there's nothing natural about women's empowerment or feminism. On the contrary, we are socialized into dependencies on mostly men. We are not socialized into thinking our best bet is to network with other women. That is not, it needs an active, it would need on the part of all of you to think of actively making those networks work, making a preference work for other women as distinct from men. You'd have to make an active, it's like it's an anti-discrimination, it would need that. Let me be, there's no two ways about it, because the world is not gender equal or gender neutral. And in universities and colleges, women are going through amazing levels of struggle as they decide where they're going to pitch themselves. And many of them then end up, many, especially at the undergraduate and so on levels, young women who have spoken to me, they see these years as precious years of freedom between the home that they have partially left and the new home that awaits them. And if they're heterosexual and so on, which most women are socialized into becoming, the question that then occupies them is, what job opportunities will I have to stand on my own feet? Or if things are so dire, let us even look at job opportunities I live in Delhi University. I don't know if you know that actual permanent employment, this is a public university, is a minority. We have guest lecture posts. We have ad hoc posts. People who have to renew their jobs, paid by the hour, paid by whatever, So as these young women, in fact, some of them, I have a MPhil PhD program that I was a part of, and they get this they're amazing women. They have amazing qualifications, but they have to negotiate their future. And their future then has to be some version of either remaining single and then dependent on their natal families and worrying about what kind of temporary lectureship they may get, or negotiate a marriage that will provide economic security. And many of them, that's also where the nature of the tie, if you have a boyfriend, are you going to go with it? Are you going to go with family? Why in India today is the arranged marriage in full form? It is showing absolutely no signs of decline. It is fully in place and has a very bright future in a context where primary economic security is going to come from marriage. So long as that's true, no other country in the world, by the way, has our kind of marriage market. It has broken down everywhere else. It existed everywhere, but it has broken down everywhere else, but we have it. It's flourishing. And let us look at why that is the case. It's a combination of economic and social characteristics. So this is the struggle that many of my students actually come to me with. And I really am sometimes heartbroken, because I would love to be the person who could sort of give them the work and give them the job opportunities. I would love to be in that position, and I'm not. And it's with sort of very open eyes that many of them have to make the decisions that they do.
Thank you, Mary. There's a question for Dakshita asking about shift in the way in public policy, civil services. And what are those evident changes that you have seen?
I think some of the worst boys network I've encountered during my service time. I've been very indifferent to it, let me tell you. I've been a bit of a very bullish person. I came from a very progressive background. I had a progressive environment at home. So for me, it didn't matter. But the gender stereotypes were very clearly defined. Again, it's a cultural context. What I'm finding now is that the increasing number of women who are joining the government space are more aware of their rights, are more aware of their themselves. But how the organization leverages their talents and whether a network is built up on that, only time tells. And government is a different space altogether. But I want to have a slightly different take on everything. I mean, we are sitting in 2022. If I can see from my own sense and the traction which I see this topic has had over the last 2 decades, since 2000, there has been a rapid change. And 2010 onwards, even more rapid. We are a society undergoing transformation. Maybe work from home becomes another scenario which eases out the burden on women. Maybe it doesn't. Who knows what happens? But it gives them that little half an hour to switch off the video and do some, do the household chores. And maybe work from home becomes an enabling platform. But what is the truth is that there is too much of population, there are fewer jobs, and therefore some of the conclusions we make have to be seen against that context. Yet we are a society under transition. Girls are making choices on marriage. Girls I meet, and I mentor a lot of girls, they don't go into the kitchen with that amount of alacrity and frequency as perhaps in my time, or even, I mean, I'm too old now, but much younger also. And the change is very evident. So many of my colleagues say our daughters don't want to get married. So it's all about education. It's about what they have seen at home. It's about economic empowerment, and it's about making a choice, good choice or bad choice. Whether it's leading to gender upliftment or not, I can't say. All I can say is that when you make a choice, you are an individual who's found your own, you found yourself. And that's what gender equality is about.
Thank you. So before we wrap up, I would like to come back to each of you for your final comments, interjections. But I would like to request you saying, if there is one or two concrete ideas in your own sphere of work, what would that be? Of saying that how do we reduce the need for these kinds of panel conversations in the years ahead? I mean, can we get to a stage where society is equal or near equal? And I think to Anjali's point about women constitute 50% of the population, and yet we treat as if they don't even exist in most of those cases. We get there. Mary, we'll start with you.
What would I like to see? I would like to see an aggressive, expansionary, employment-centric policy by our government. It needs to come from the government, and it needs to then be picked up by business and other groups. And I do believe that that would make for social cultural changes. Social cultural take their cue, and I think others have said this very well. Social and cultural changes take their cue from the economic. That's how things happen. They have reasons to either modify themselves or to reinforce themselves. So I would like to see those changes put in place so that women could actually be offered something and then actually say no, rather than find themselves discriminated. I think there is a considerable amount of discrimination. The educational spaces have opened up. I don't know for how long. The one of the reasons they've opened up is that so far fees and so on have been within certain, at least in some areas, higher education was largely subsidized. If that changes tomorrow and fees become, you're like Ashoka University or Jindal becomes the new standard, I wonder whether that will not bring about a huge demographic shift in terms of gender, quite apart from the class and caste repercussions of such a change. So that's a worry. If you're going to go the privatization route for higher education, which is where things seem to be headed, going by the new education policy, I worry about its gender impact. Will those wonderful figures of more women change? Because then parents will have to decide whether this is part of the dowry or not. Those the fees that they may now have to pay. What are the calculations that will go into that? I don't know. So I do think a very aggressive employment policy, which I think is where East Asia and so on have really gained on us. And it has been a very much a state come business kind of arrangement, whether it's Korea or China and so on. We should learn from them. And I think it would make young women have a less gloomy sense of their futures.
Thank you, Mary. Anjali, closing comments, please.
So, China and Korea, and there are trends there now where women are marrying later, having fewer children, choosing to not marry and choosing to not have children. And this is particularly in Korea and Japan, which even though they have progressed economically, seem to actually not have made social progress. So Mary, with a little bit different from what you said, economic growth is not the only piece. In fact, it is suggesting that their social attitudes, it's not a good place to work really for these countries. And I've worked there as part of what I've done earlier, and their social attitudes don't necessarily change with economic progress. They actually require a targeted intervention. State can play a role. I think society has to play a role. We will not get to equitable workplaces until we have equitable home places. Recognition of domestic work as work, and women finding it within themselves, because we've talked about all the other actors, right? We've talked about the state and organizations and institutions and society, but what about the individual? She has to want it enough. There's the notion of leaning in. Everybody has to lean in. You want to get work, you want to earn income, you want to be successful, you have to lean in, man or woman. Somehow we are socializing out of our girls the desire to achieve and succeed. Or rather, the definition of achievement and success is being defined in the daira of the family and the home. So if you want to maintain and not go down the Korea, etc., route, where girls are actually now choosing to not get married and have children, so then they don't have to deal with the constraints of the daira of the home, then we must make our homes more supportive. Workplaces will follow.
So there's a question from the audience. Would focusing on men solve this problem better than focusing on women? It's the entire narrative of gender equality. Anjali, do you want to take this question?
So again, I'm going to put this out. We are blue sky brainstorming here, right? We have now
Sure.
for 2 generations supported our girl children to go to school, get educated, be aspirational, be ambitious. What have we done with those 2 generations of our boys? So as an experiment for the next generation of boys now going through school, what if their moms more than dads were to tell them that no one's going to look after you? Your wife, whenever you have a wife, if you have a wife, is not there, it's not going to look after you. So learn to look after yourself. I wonder how that will change things in the home place.
Interesting paradigm. Dakshita, over to you.
Oh, I love that, Anjali. Well, my last thoughts, if it's all about educating girls so that they come out and shine in the vocational spaces, my guess is that I would like to look at organizations which support totally gender neutral frameworks of operation, so that biases and lingering social mores don't carry. Merit is the only criteria. Merit and performance. I can say that with personal conviction, nothing works like merit. And an organization has to be like that. If I look back on my 35 years of career, somewhere I always focused, I've got to do this, I've got to do that. And I think that helped me. I'm not saying I'm a perfect example. Please don't misunderstand that way. But when I have conversations with other women, instead of complaints, you get into achievement. And that's what I like to look at. And once we have that, everything will change. The economics will change, the way she operates at home will change, the way she is with her mother-in-law, father-in-law, husband, blah, blah, blah will change. Everything changes. Let's have organizations which are merit-based. They might have a recruitment quota for girls post college, but that's where it should end.
Thank you. I mean, just to use a cliched phrase, right? I mean, women, men, and men think that they influence women or control, if I can use that word. Anjali, do you want to say something?
Sorry, Srinath, I did actually want to call out, in a positive sense, men. All of this, even if you go back to post-independence India or 50 years ago, things were so much worse. Why are things better? Because we've actually had leaders, and even for my generation, most of our leaders were men. So our sponsors, champions, mentors, whether at home or outside in the workplace, were men. So this is not a lonely battle to be fought by women alone. If you're going to win the diversity war, it has to be a diverse dialogue. So I would like to actually see, just as we don't like to see manuals anymore, we should not have channels anymore either. To solve D&I, we need to have D&I, real diverse dialogue, and involve the men more, because they are going to be they are already actually a big part of the solution, and have whatever progress we are seeing has been supported and led and sponsored by a lot of wonderful men. So I do want to call out all the great positive men, including our spouses and fathers and brothers, not just, and our mothers, all of us.
Thank you. That made my closing remarks far easier. So I was going to say the same thing, saying that the usual cliche where men feel that they control the narrative, and the word women subsumes men as the word. I think it's a universe where we'll have to work together, and sooner, faster, quicker, more accurate we work on this, I think better outcomes will be there for the next generation. So with that, I will leave it back to Sajna. Thank you, Anjali, Dakshita, Mary, for the wonderful conversation. And back to Sanjana.
Thank you, Srinath. And thank you, all my esteemed panelists, for animating such a lively discussion. And hope to see you all very soon. Thank you to all the participants also for your questions and your active participation. We hope to see you soon in another edition of another Policy Circle webinar. Thank you and have a great day, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.